The afternoon sun glared through the large supermarket windows, casting long shadows across the aisles as Cheryl navigated the bustling store. Her belly, round and heavy with the weight of her unborn child, swayed with each step she took. Her breathing was measured, calm, but there was a quiet tension behind her eyes. As a black woman in her third trimester, she had long gotten used to the stares, the glances that lingered just a little too long, and the subtle judgment that seemed to follow her everywhere. Cheryl knew her situation wasn't unique, racism was an everyday reality. But today, all she wanted was to make it through her grocery list and get home before her feet swelled any further. She had heard enough horror stories of how pregnant black women were treated in hospitals, and she knew that staying calm and avoiding stress was essential for her health and her baby's. She held on to that thought as she reached for a box of pasta from the shelf, focusing on the mundane task to keep her anxiety at bay. "Excuse me, miss," came a sharp voice behind her. Cheryl didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The voice had a familiar edge, cold, accusatory, and unmistakably condescending. She took a breath before turning to face the woman who had interrupted her. Standing there, in a perfectly pressed floral blouse and beige slacks, was Marjorie Benson. Marjorie was a fixture in the neighborhood, a woman who seemed to believe the world was hers to police. She stood with her arms crossed, her lips pursed in disapproval. "Yes?" Cheryl asked, keeping her voice steady. "I've noticed you've been in here quite a while," Marjorie said, her gaze narrowing. "Seems like you've been lingering." Cheryl blinked, confusion flashing across her face. "I'm just shopping, same as everyone else." Marjorie tilted her head slightly, her eyes flicking down to Cheryl's stomach with a look that Cheryl had seen 100 times before, one of thinly veiled judgment. "Well, I just thought it was strange. You've been walking around without putting much in your cart." Cheryl glanced down at her half-empty cart, then back at Marjorie. "I'm taking my time," she said, her irritation bubbling just beneath the surface. "I have a lot on my mind." Marjorie's smirk was small but unmistakable. "Of course," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Just thought I'd check. We've had issues before, you know." Cheryl's pulse quickened. She knew exactly what Marjorie meant. Issues. Theft. Crime. The unspoken implication that because she was black, she was more likely to be up to no good. She had heard it all before. But today, with the weight of her pregnancy and the exhaustion pulling at her, she wasn't in the mood for a passive-aggressive confrontation. "Is there something you need?" Cheryl asked, her voice tight. "Because if not, I'd like to finish shopping in peace." Marjorie's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, hard stare. "I'm just making sure everything's in order," she said. "You never know these days." Cheryl turned back to the shelf, biting her tongue. She had no intention of giving Marjorie the satisfaction of a response. But as she moved further down the aisle, she could feel the woman's eyes boring into her back, her presence an oppressive weight that made every step heavier. Cheryl continued her shopping, trying her best to ignore the unease building in her chest. She had just finished grabbing a few cans of soup when she felt it again, Marjorie's eyes, watching her from a few aisles away. It was becoming unbearable. She had dealt with plenty of racially charged encounters in her life, but something about today felt different. More intense. More dangerous. Her hands trembled as she placed the soup cans in her cart. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment and focusing on her baby's soft kicks inside her. She had to stay calm, for her baby's sake. Just as she was about to head toward the checkout lanes, she heard raised voices near the front of the store. She couldn't quite make out what was being said, but the tone was unmistakable: anger. Anxiety prickled at the back of her neck, and Cheryl's heart began to race. A few moments later, 2 store security guards appeared at the end of her aisle. One was a tall, muscular man with a stern expression, and the other was a shorter, stockier man who looked as though he had seen his fair share of confrontations. They walked straight toward her, their eyes cold and unyielding. "Ma'am," the taller guard said, his voice low and authoritative. "We need you to come with us." Cheryl froze, her mind racing. What? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why? We've had a report of suspicious behavior, the shorter guard said, his tone even colder than the first. Cheryl's stomach twisted. Suspicious behavior, she repeated, her voice rising with disbelief. I haven't done anything. Ma'am, please cooperate, the taller guard said, stepping closer. We need to check your belongings and ask you a few questions. Cheryl's heart pounded in her chest. Her breath came in short, quick gasps as she looked around, searching for any sign of help. But the other shoppers had already started to back away, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. No one stepped forward. No one said a word. I haven't stolen anything, Cheryl said, her voice shaking. You can check my cart. I'm just shopping. The shorter guard crossed his arms, his expression hardening. We'll see about that. It was then that Cheryl spotted Marjorie standing near the front of the store, watching with a smug smile. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Marjorie had done this. She had called security on her for no other reason than the fact that she was black. I didn't do anything, Cheryl said, her voice louder now, more desperate. This is wrong. The taller guard reached out to take her arm, but Cheryl instinctively pulled back. Her body tensed as panic began to set in. The baby kicked again, hard this time, as if responding to her distress. She couldn't let this escalate. She had to protect her child. Ma'am, we need you to calm down, the taller guard said, his tone growing sharper. We're just doing our job. Cheryl's vision blurred with tears, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. She couldn't let them take her. Not like this. Not in front of all these people. I'm not going anywhere, she said, her voice shaking. Not until someone tells me what I'm being accused of. The guards exchanged glances, clearly growing impatient. The shorter one took a step forward, his hand hovering over the walkie-talkie on his belt. We can make this easy, he said, or we can call the police. At the mention of the police, a cold wave of fear washed over Cheryl. She had heard too many stories of black people being brutalized or killed by law enforcement over minor infractions, or, worse, for doing nothing at all. Her mind flashed to images of Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, and countless others whose lives had been cut short by a system that saw them as threats rather than human beings. The thought of being handcuffed, of being dragged out of the store in front of all these people, made her feel physically ill. But the thought of something happening to her baby, of the stress causing complications, was even worse. Cheryl started, but her voice caught in her throat. I just want to leave. Not until we've cleared this up, the taller guard said. At that moment, the doors to the supermarket swung open, and a tall man in a tailored suit walked in. His dark skin gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and his expression was one of calm authority. He carried himself with a confidence that immediately commanded attention, and the crowd seemed to part for him as he made his way toward Cheryl and the guards. Excuse me, the man said, his voice deep and firm. What seems to be the problem here? The guard straightened, clearly taken aback by the man's presence. Sir, this is a private matter, the shorter guard said. We're handling it. The man raised an eyebrow. It doesn't look like you're handling anything. I'm an attorney, and I happen to know this woman. Cheryl blinked, confused. She didn't recognize the man, but something about his calm demeanor made her feel a flicker of hope. We've had a report of suspicious behavior, the taller guard said, his tone less confident now. We just need to ask her a few questions. The man's eyes flicked to Marjorie, who was still standing nearby, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of curiosity and triumph. And who made this report? The guards hesitated. The taller one gestured vaguely in Marjorie's direction. A concerned customer. The man's expression darkened. A concerned customer, he repeated, his voice growing colder. Or someone acting on their racial bias? Marjorie's face flushed bright red. I didn't do anything wrong, she stammered. I was just what, the man interrupted, his gaze sharp. Just assuming this woman was a criminal because of the color of her skin? Marjorie sputtered, her eyes darting around the store as if looking for someone to back her up. But the crowd remained silent, their eyes now fixed on the man. I think we've had enough of this, the man said, turning back to the guards. Unless you have solid evidence that this woman has committed a crime, I suggest you let her go. The guards exchanged uncertain glances. The tension in the air was thick, but the man's authority was undeniable. We don't want any trouble, the shorter guard muttered. Then let her go, the man said, his voice final. After a long moment, the taller guard nodded. Fine. You're free to go, ma'am. Cheryl exhaled, her legs shaking beneath her. She had never felt so relieved, yet so drained. The man stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. Are you all right? He asked gently. Cheryl nodded, though her throat felt tight with emotion. I think so. Thank you. The man smiled softly. Let's get you out of here. As they walked toward the exit, Cheryl couldn't help but glance back at Marjorie. The woman was standing frozen, her face pale with shock and embarrassment. For the first time since the confrontation began, Cheryl felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was a small spark of victory, a reminder that despite everything, she had come out of this situation with her dignity intact. But as she stepped out into the cool afternoon air, Cheryl knew the fight wasn't over. This wasn't the first time she had faced racism, and it wouldn't be the last. She had a long road ahead of her, both as a black woman and as a soon-to-be mother. But today, she had taken the first step in reclaiming her power. She glanced down at her belly, feeling the baby kick again. A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time, it wasn't one of fear or sadness. It was one of hope for her child. She would keep fighting. As Cheryl walked out into the parking lot, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline that had flooded her body moments earlier, the world felt strangely different. The air was cool against her flushed skin, but her chest still felt tight, as if the weight of the confrontation was pressing down on her lungs. Marcus, the man who had come to her aid, walked silently beside her. His presence was a calming one, and for that, she was grateful. But even with his help, Cheryl couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far from over. Once they reached her car, Marcus turned to her, his eyes filled with concern. Do you need help getting home? He asked. I can call someone for you, or drive you myself if you're feeling unsteady. Cheryl shook her head. No, I'll be all right, she said, though her voice wavered. Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up. Marcus smiled softly, but there was a hardness in his gaze. Unfortunately, I've seen things like this happen too many times. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Cheryl bit her lip, her mind flashing back to Marjorie's smug expression, the store security guards towering over her, and the whispers of the other shoppers. She had been so close to breaking down, so close to losing control of the situation, and who knows what would have happened then. The thought made her stomach churn. I just wanted to get groceries, she said quietly, more to herself than to Marcus. I just wanted a normal day. I know, Marcus replied gently. And you deserve that. What happened in there wasn't right. Cheryl let out a shaky breath, her eyes welling with tears. It happens all the time, though, she whispered. Everywhere I go, it feels like I'm walking on eggshells. Like I'm always one wrong move away from something terrible happening. Marcus nodded, his expression somber. It shouldn't be like that. But you don't have to go through this alone. If you need legal help or just someone to talk to, I'm here. Cheryl managed a small smile through her tears. Thank you, she said again. I don't know how to repay you. You don't owe me anything, Marcus replied. But if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. He handed her a business card. My number's on there. I'm a civil rights attorney, so if anything like this ever happens again, you'll have someone in your corner. Cheryl took the card, her fingers brushing over the raised letters. She didn't know if she would ever call him, but just knowing that there was someone who cared enough to offer help was enough for now. Take care of yourself, Marcus said, giving her a final nod before walking toward his own car. Cheryl watched him go, feeling a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion wash over her. She glanced down at her belly, feeling another soft kick. Her baby was still there, still safe. But the world she was bringing her child into, how could she protect her baby from the same hatred and fear she had just faced? She got into her car and sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel, trying to collect her thoughts. The whole incident had shaken her to the core. She had always been aware of the racism that lingered in the background of her life, but this was different. This was direct. Aggressive. And it wasn't just about her, it was about her baby, too. Chapter 2, The Weight of the World. The drive home was a blur. Cheryl barely registered the familiar streets passing by as her mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened. By the time she pulled into her driveway, her hands were steady again, but her heart was still pounding. She sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at the front door of her small, cozy home, trying to gather the strength to walk inside and pretend that everything was normal. When she finally opened the door, the scent of lavender greeted her, a calming aroma that she had grown to love. Her husband, Devin, was sitting on the couch, his laptop open in front of him as he worked. He looked up as she walked in, his face lighting up with a smile that quickly faded when he saw the look on her face. "Cheryl, what's wrong?" he asked, standing up and walking over to her. His hands gently cupped her face, his eyes searching hers with concern. Cheryl shook her head, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over. "It happened again," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was just trying to get groceries, and that woman, she called security on me. She said I was stealing. I didn't do anything, Devin." Devin's jaw tightened, his expression hardening as he pulled her into his arms. "I'm so sorry," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that again." Cheryl clung to him, her body shaking with sobs. She had been holding it together for so long, trying to be strong, trying to protect her baby from the stress. But now, in the safety of her husband's embrace, she allowed herself to fall apart. "It's not fair," she cried. "Why does this keep happening? Why can't I just be left alone?" Devin held her tighter, his own anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I wish I had answers. But I'm here, and I'm not going to let anyone hurt you." They stood there in the living room, holding each other, the weight of the world pressing down on their shoulders. Cheryl knew Devin was just as scared as she was. He had always been protective of her, especially since she got pregnant. But there was only so much he could do. The world outside their home was unpredictable, dangerous, and filled with people who saw their skin color as a threat. After a long moment, Cheryl pulled back, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "There was a man," she said, her voice still shaky. "A lawyer. He stepped in and helped me. He stopped them from taking me to the back of the store. I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't been there." Devin's brow furrowed. "A lawyer?" Cheryl nodded, pulling the business card from her pocket and handing it to him. "Marcus Howard. He said he's a civil rights attorney." Devin studied the card for a moment before nodding. "We should reach out to him," he said. "Even if nothing comes of it, it's good to have someone like that on our side." Cheryl sighed, exhaustion settling deep into her bones. "Maybe," she murmured. "But right now, I just want to forget about it. I just want to focus on the baby." Devin wrapped his arm around her shoulders, guiding her to the couch. "Come on, sit down. You need to rest. I'll make you some tea." Cheryl smiled weakly, grateful for her husband's support. She sank into the couch, letting the cushions cradle her aching body. As Devin disappeared into the kitchen, she closed her eyes, trying to block out the images of Marjorie's smug face and the security guards looming over her, but the memories wouldn't leave. They clung to her, refusing to fade. Chapter 3, Marjorie's Reckoning. Meanwhile, Marjorie Benson sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at the cup of coffee in front of her. She had spent the entire drive home from the supermarket replaying the incident in her mind, her heart still racing with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. That man, Marcus, had humiliated her in front of everyone. He had made her look like a fool, but as she sat there, the smug satisfaction she had felt earlier began to wane. For the first time, Marjorie started to question herself. Had she really done the right thing? Was Cheryl actually stealing, or had she just assumed that because of the color of her skin, Marjorie's mother had raised her to believe that certain people couldn't be trusted? It was a lesson that had been drilled into her from a young age, reinforced by the people in her community and the media she consumed. She had grown up in a world where black people were seen as dangerous, inferior, and unworthy of respect. And for most of her life, Marjorie had never questioned those beliefs, but now, sitting alone in her quiet kitchen, something about the way Marcus had looked at her, so full of righteous anger, made her feel small. He had accused her of being racist, of acting on prejudice rather than fact. And though Marjorie wanted to deny it, wanted to cling to the belief that she was in the right, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. The thought unsettled her. Marjorie had always prided herself on being a good person, someone who followed the rules and did what was right. But now, she couldn't help but wonder if her actions had caused harm, if she had judged Cheryl unfairly. Her hands shook as she picked up her phone, scrolling through her social media feed. She saw post after post about racial injustice, about black people being mistreated, and for the first time, she didn't scroll past them. She clicked on an article, reading about the systemic racism that pervaded every aspect of society. It was uncomfortable. It was painful. But Marjorie couldn't look away. Chapter 4, Cheryl's Resolve. A few days after the incident, Cheryl sat by the large window in her living room, sunlight streaming through the glass, illuminating the worn pages of the baby book she had been reading. It was meant to be a relaxing afternoon, a moment to focus on her pregnancy, but her mind kept wandering back to the supermarket. The weight of what had happened was still fresh in her mind. She had spent the last few days replaying the events, trying to make sense of it all. The fear that had gripped her when the security guards approached her still lingered in the pit of her stomach. What could have happened if Marcus hadn't intervened? She couldn't shake the thought that, in another version of the story, she might not have made it out of that store unscathed. Her phone buzzed on the table next to her, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Marcus's name flashed across it. A small wave of relief washed over her as she picked up the call. "Hello?" she answered, her voice still soft, uncertain. "Cheryl, it's Marcus," came the familiar, calming voice on the other end of the line. "I've been thinking about you and the incident. How are you holding up?" Cheryl paused, considering her response. "I'm okay," she said slowly. "It's just been a lot to process. I keep thinking about what could have happened if you hadn't been there." Marcus was silent for a moment before speaking again, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to go through this alone. I want to help. I've been thinking about the legal options we could pursue. If you're up for it, we can hold the supermarket accountable for their discriminatory actions. You shouldn't have to be afraid every time you step into a store." Cheryl bit her lip. The idea of taking legal action hadn't crossed her mind, but now that Marcus mentioned it, a spark of anger flared inside her. Why should she stay silent? Why should she let Marjorie and the supermarket staff get away with their treatment of her? "Do you really think we have a case?" Cheryl asked, her voice tinged with hesitation but also curiosity. "I do," Marcus said confidently. "It's not just about what happened to you in that store. This is about a pattern of racial profiling, a system that's built to criminalize people of color for simply existing. We can shine a light on that and demand accountability." Cheryl thought about her baby, about the world she would bring her child into. A world where black people were still seen as threats, still treated as second-class citizens. She didn't want her child to grow up feeling the same fear she had felt in that store. Maybe, just maybe, taking a stand now could help build a better future for the next generation. "Okay," she said, her voice firming with resolve. Let's do it. I'm tired of being afraid. Chapter 5. Preparing for battle. Over the next few weeks, Cheryl and Marcus worked together, gathering evidence, filing reports, and preparing for what would likely be a drawn-out legal battle. Cheryl's days were filled with meetings and phone calls, and though it was exhausting, there was a sense of purpose that pushed her forward. Devin supported her every step of the way, reminding her that she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for their family, for their future child. The media had gotten wind of the case, and soon Cheryl's story was making headlines in the local news. Pregnant black woman falsely accused of shoplifting. Read the headline on one news site, the accompanying article detailing the events of that day in the supermarket. The attention was overwhelming, but it also brought a wave of support from the community. Black mothers, activists, and allies reached out to Cheryl, sharing their own stories of racial profiling, encouraging her to keep fighting. But not everyone was on her side. One evening, as Cheryl was scrolling through social media, she stumbled upon a comment thread beneath one of the news articles about her case. Her heart sank as she read the hateful messages left by strangers. She was probably stealing, one comment read. Why else would they stop her? She's playing the race card, another person wrote. Black people always make everything about race. Cheryl's stomach twisted as the comments continued, each one more hurtful than the last. She had known there would be backlash, there always was when black people spoke up about racism, but seeing it in front of her, in such stark and cruel terms, made her feel sick. Devin found her later that night, sitting on the couch with her phone in her hands, her eyes red from holding back tears. Cheryl, he said softly, sitting down beside her. Don't read those comments. They're just ignorant people who don't know what they're talking about. I know, Cheryl whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But it still hurts. How can people hate me when they don't even know me? Devin wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. Because they're afraid. Afraid of change, afraid of losing their power. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. You're doing the right thing. Cheryl nodded, but the hurt lingered. The weight of the fight was starting to take its toll, and with her due date approaching, she worried about how the stress might affect her baby. But every time she thought about giving up, she remembered the look on Marjorie's face that day in the store, the smugness, the certainty that she had the power to ruin Cheryl's day, her life even, without consequence. And that thought reignited the fire inside her. She couldn't give up. Not now. Chapter 6, Marjorie's guilt. Marjorie Benson hadn't slept well since the incident at the supermarket. Night after night, she found herself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the confrontation in her mind. At first, she had been convinced she was in the right, that she had done the responsible thing by calling security. But the more she thought about it, the more the doubt began to creep in. She had grown up in a small, mostly white town where everyone knew everyone, and people who didn't look like her were often talked about with suspicion. Her parents had taught her to be careful around certain kinds of people, though they had never said it outright. Marjorie had understood what they meant. Black people, Hispanic people, anyone who didn't fit into their narrow view of normal was to be feared. It was just how things were, but Marcus's words that day had shaken her. He had called her out in front of everyone, accused her of racial profiling, of acting on her own prejudice. And deep down, though Marjorie had initially dismissed it, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that maybe he had been right. She had assumed Cheryl was a thief because of her race. There was no other explanation for it. That it wasn't a pleasant realization. In fact, it made Marjorie feel sick to her stomach. She had always thought of herself as a good person, someone who was fair and just. But now, as she sat alone in her kitchen, sipping her coffee in the silence of her pristine home, she couldn't help but wonder if she was part of the problem. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking her thoughts. It was a news notification about the lawsuit Cheryl had filed against the supermarket. Marjorie's breath caught in her throat as she read the headline. She had known the case would get media attention, but seeing it plastered across her phone screen made it all feel too real. Her mind raced as she thought about the possibility of being called to testify, of having her role in the incident exposed to the public. The shame burned in her chest, but what was worse was the guilt. For the first time in her life, Marjorie was starting to realize the harm her actions had caused, not just to Cheryl, but to countless other black people who had been unfairly judged, mistreated, or criminalized because of their skin color. She had to do something. With shaking hands, Marjorie picked up her phone and dialed the number for the supermarket's corporate office. She wasn't sure what she was going to say, but she knew she had to speak up, to own up to her part in what had happened. It was the least she could do. Chapter 7. The legal battle. Months passed, and the legal battle between Cheryl and the supermarket was in full swing. Marcus had been relentless, filing motions, gathering evidence, and building a case that shined a harsh light on the discriminatory practices that had led to Cheryl's unjust treatment. Depositions were taken, witnesses interviewed, and slowly but surely, the truth began to emerge. The supermarket's lawyers tried to paint Cheryl as a difficult customer, someone who had refused to cooperate with security. But Marcus skillfully dismantled their arguments, presenting security footage that showed Cheryl calmly shopping, minding her own business until the moment Marjorie called for security. Marjorie had been subpoenaed to testify, and as the day of her deposition approached, her anxiety grew. She hadn't been able to shake the guilt that had been gnawing at her since the incident, and now, faced with the prospect of answering for her actions under oath, the weight of her decision pressed down on her like never before. When the day finally came, Marjorie sat across from Marcus in a sterile conference room, her hands trembling in her lap. She had expected him to be hostile, to rip into her with the same fire he had shown in the supermarket. But instead, he was calm, measured, and devastatingly precise in his questions. "Mrs. Benson," Marcus began, "you reported Cheryl to security that day because you believed she was shoplifting. Is that correct?" Marjorie nodded, her throat dry. "Yes." "And what, specifically, led you to believe she was shoplifting?" Marjorie hesitated, her mind scrambling for a justification. I thought she was acting suspiciously. She wasn't putting much in her cart, and she seemed to be walking around aimlessly." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Walking around aimlessly," he repeated. "You mean, shopping?" Marjorie's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Well, yes, but, Mrs. Benson," Marcus interrupted gently, his tone soft but firm. "If Cheryl had been a white woman, would you have reported her to security for the same behavior?" The question hung in the air, heavy and damning. Marjorie's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to say yes, to insist that race had nothing to do with it. But she couldn't. She couldn't lie, not after everything. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I wouldn't have." Chapter 8. Justice and change. In the end, the case settled in Cheryl's favor. The supermarket issued a formal apology, and a significant settlement was awarded to Cheryl for the emotional distress she had endured. But more importantly, the case had brought national attention to the issue of racial profiling in retail spaces, sparking conversations about systemic racism that went beyond the walls of the courtroom. For Cheryl, the settlement was a victory, but it wasn't just about the money. It was about standing up for herself, for her baby, and for all the other black women who had been unfairly targeted because of the color of their skin. It was about reclaiming her dignity and showing the world that she wouldn't be silenced. A few weeks after the case was settled, Cheryl gave birth to a healthy baby girl. As she held her daughter in her arms for the first time, tears of joy and relief streamed down her face. This little girl, this beautiful new life, represented hope. A future where things could be different, where the fight she had fought would make the world a little safer, a little more just. Marcus remained in touch with Cheryl and Devin, offering legal advice and support whenever they needed it. His work as a civil rights attorney had always been about more than just winning cases, it was about creating lasting change. And this case, with Cheryl's bravery at the forefront, had done just that. Marjorie, too, had been changed by the events that had unfolded. The guilt she had carried had led her to take a hard look at her own prejudices, and though it was a painful process, she began to unlearn the toxic beliefs she had held for so long. She started attending racial justice workshops, educating herself on the realities of systemic racism, and even became involved in local efforts to combat racial profiling in retail spaces. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but Marjorie was committed to doing better. To being better. Epilogue, a new beginning. Years later, Cheryl stood in the park, watching her daughter, now a bright and energetic toddler, play in the grass. The sun was shining, and the air was filled with the sound of children laughing. Devon sat beside her on the bench, his hand resting on her shoulder as they watched their little girl chase after a butterfly. Cheryl smiled, her heart full of love and hope. The world wasn't perfect, and there was still so much work to be done. But in this moment, surrounded by the warmth of her family, she felt a sense of peace. She had fought for her child's future, and though the fight wasn't over, she knew she had made a difference. She had broken the chains of fear and silence. And that was just the beginning.